Tatsalach oi kaloma, li loitza, nunu si hlautuama. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Beth Piatot and I'm an associate professor of English and comparative literature and the director of the Arts Research Center here at UC Berkeley. It's my pleasure today to introduce our program with Deborah Miranda in conversation with Professor Estelle Tarica. It is a common convention to begin a program with a land acknowledgement, and certainly we acknowledge that we are meeting today on Huichin, the land of the Ohlone people, who have always been and will always be the caretakers of this land. But land acknowledgements without material commitments are empty gestures. The Arts Research Center is committed to supporting and amplifying the voices of Native American artists and upholding their political and artistic values and visions. It's a great pleasure today to recognize and support Deborah Miranda, a writer and scholar who's an enrolled member of the Ohlone, Costanoan, Esselen Nation in California, along with Santa Ynez, Chumash, English, and French heritage. We will hear more about Deborah Miranda's work when I turn the mic over to Professor Tarica, who envisioned this program and will be in conversation with Professor Miranda following the reading. Before I introduce Professor Tarica, I wish to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of English, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Center for Race and Gender. And I thank you all for joining us today, for coming from near and far to hear these words. Estelle Tarica is a professor of Latin American literature and culture. Her research and teaching examines colonial legacies in modern Latin America, Indigenous and Jewish memory cultures, and the transformative power of narrative and poetry. Her first book, The Inner Life of Mestizo Nationalism, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2008, explores the subjective effects of racialized national identity formations in Mexico, Bolivia, and Peru. Her second book, Holocaust Consciousness and Cold War Violence in Latin America, released by SUNY Press in 2022, is about the impact of Holocaust memories and terminologies as reference points for authors and activists confronting state violence in Argentina, Mexico, and Guatemala in the 1960s to the present. Knowing that these are Professor Tarica's research interests, I think is very clear about the base of her interest in Professor Miranda's book. So it is with great pleasure that I invite Professor Tarica to come and introduce our guest today, Deborah Miranda. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Beth, for your kind words, your introduction, and for everything that you've done to make this event possible as the director of the Arts Research Center. And thank you also to Laurie McPhee and everyone there for organizing and sponsoring the event, and to all of the people behind the scenes who are recording and tweeting and captioning all of the media that comes out of this event. A few months ago, Beth had announced that the Arts Research Center can support instructors to bring authors and artists to their classes, and I immediately was like, oh, let's bring Deborah Miranda, and you made it so it's wonderful. This event is taking place in the context of the course Spanish 135 AC, Indigenous and Latinx Pathways of Memory in California. It's a course that is inspired by the concept of the memory path that Bolivian indigenous scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui has revitalized for contemporary anti-colonial practices. A memory path is a physical or imaginative journey across the local landscape and into the past. It's an act of symbolic reconstitution that confronts colonial legacies of fragmentation. So with all of that, it is a tremendous honor for me to present Deborah A. Miranda to you today. Her poetry and prose are imaginative memory paths that illuminate the darkest periods of California's history. She's a scholar, a former English professor, and a prize-winning author. She's published 4 poetry collections, including Indian Cartography, which was the winner of the Diane Decora First Book Award, The Zen of La Llorona, Raised by Humans, and Altar for Broken Things. She has a 5th poetry book, titled Pilgrimage, which is forthcoming from Seven Kitchens Press. Deborah is also one of the co-editors of the book Sovereign Erotics, an anthology of two-spirit literature, which received a finalist award from the Lambda Award. And her book, Bad Indians, a Tribal Memoir, which she'll be reading from today, first appeared in 2013 and was the winner of the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award. The publisher of Bad Indians is based right here in Berkeley, Heyday Books, and they recently issued a revised and expanded 10th anniversary edition of this acclaimed book, and a paperback version of that will be out later this year. Deborah has a long-standing connection to UC Berkeley. She's conducted research in the Bancroft Library and has been a participant in the Breath of Life Conference, which works to revitalize California's indigenous languages, which is sponsored by our linguistics department and the group Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival. Deborah's become a memory keeper of sorts of the Estelen language. Indeed, she recently completed a poetry collection titled Maxana Chempapisi, Blood Writing, which explores the depth of meaning in individual Estelen words. She's currently working on a coffee table book about the California missions, told from an indigenous perspective. It deconstructs the glossy coffee table books that are sold in mission gift shops across the state and that function as genocidal propaganda against the lives of California Indians. She's also working on a collection of essays examining gender and survivance in California missions based on the stories of Isabel Meadows. Meadows is a Rumsen storyteller who was born in 1846 and who left behind extensive documentation of indigenous cultures and histories in and around Carmel Mission. And those of you who've read Bad Indians will recognize Isabel Meadows as the source for some of the histories that Deborah recounts in that book. She's one of the many storytellers that Deborah dialogues with in her work, storytellers who kept faith that their words would reach the generations to come and help them live better lives. These are the good ancestors that literary critic Daniel Heath Justice talks about in his work. A good ancestor asks, and I'm quoting, "How do we create the kind of world and relationships that will nurture those who came after and give them cause to thank us rather than curse or grieve our destructive selfishness? And what does literature do to help guide this work?" Deborah, I know of no better guide to this beautiful, difficult work than you. I'm so deeply thrilled that you're here to share your writing with us. So please join me in welcoming Deborah back to Berkeley.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Dr. Tarica, for that beautiful introduction. It's so good to see you all, and I'm really pleased to be here. I'm going to try to make this a little shorter because I'm a little shorter. All right, first things first, reading glasses on. Ta-da! Special powers with these glasses. All right, I am actually trying to keep to a particular time so that we have time for that conversation afterwards. So I'll try to keep my comments about the poems to just a few words. Some of the new poems that are out in the 10th anniversary edition are poems or pieces that came through continued research. I have found my life's work. It's going to follow me around for the rest of my life. And I can't resist these poems when they come. I spent some time in Washington, D.C. and found some new material from Isabel. So this poem is called The People Before, and it's a found poem from the stories of Isabel Meadows that I found there in the Smithsonian. This poem is in Isabel's voice. The people before. The people from before, they were so old, they grew like mountains. The people before didn't cure themselves with doctors. They cured themselves only with herbs from the countryside and with songs. There were wild strawberries on the Carmel River banks, lots of them, sweeter than tame strawberries. Omasia knew the names of the constellations. She knew the siete cabrillas and told which ones come out in the summer. The people here did not say don, señor, but always tío, tía, or some relationship name, though they were not relations. Even to the Americans, they applied these terms. At El Monte del Diablo, Fortunato beat the devil out of all the Indians gambling there, and at San Antonio. When dancing, he used to make a big toad come hopping out of the fire. And they made cayucos, canoes before, of tules. There used to be a big lake just this side of the mission in the time of Junipero, and the padre used to like to ride out there in El Cayuco on that lake on Sundays. The Indian boys would take him out. The cayuco was woven of tules. I don't know how. When they hung her son, Santiago Tiques, from an old oak that still stands, Omasio threw down her azadon where she was standing and cried, "They tear it, they eat it, they swallow our flesh, the Americans." A deer will attack a person, bringing both front feet down upon him, and they cut. Arnasio Tiques once killed an elk at El Peñon and had it hanging up at his house. We looked on it with fear. I remember seeing it as if in a dream. My brother later found the skeleton of an elk in the hills. I think it must have been the compañero of the last elk that was killed at Monterey. My mother knew how to say a prayer for the repose of the soul of him that buried treasure. That's the way that one should do. My mother told me that the Indians, when they went out to work, took a little stick, and when the shadow of it was very straight, it was midday, and they ate where they were, in El Potrero. Ignacia Cornelio, my grandmother, was the one that cooked pozole at the mission, carried their lonche of trigo, maíz, chícharo, or garbancillo. The Indios sat on the ground, ate using clamshells as spoons. If I had known how to write, I would have written up the life of those Indians. If they had not all died, the Indians here, the country would be full of them telling stories. I just want to reach back in time and say, Isabel, we are. This next piece is called Cousins for Victor. It's about the third gender that was so common in California when it was quote unquote discovered. Cousins. We dressed in skirts of tule or deerskin, worked hard side by side with our sisters, gathering and pounding acorns with pestles into the bedrock slabs, weaving tight baskets and caring for the sick child or wandering toddler. We shared secrets about men, stories about lovers, remedies for broken hearts. Our sisters opened the way for the next generation, gave birth to the tribe's future with each squalling, hungry voice. It was dangerous work, but they had charms of creation inscribed in their spirits and flesh. We midwifed the dead, carried each body tenderly from this world to the next without risking contamination, always in two worlds at once, poised between. We kept our balance on those slippery paths between life and death. Then the soldiers came, the priests came, christened us joyas, jewels, laughing at how our tribes treated us as treasures. Treasures. They called us monsters, nefando pecados, mujerados. Joya was a joke. But we had other names before that. Aki, Koya, Kuit, Ulukwe, endearments only the ancestors remember. In the missions, we were stripped bare, whipped, made to sweep the plaza for days, pointed at, cursed. In the South, we fed your kind to the dogs, soldiers grinned, and stroked the heads of their mastiffs. Worst of all, Threatened with beatings, our own husbands disowned us. Children grew to fear us, and our sisters, oh, our sisters, turned us away. Some of us fled into the mountains, died alone. Some found new homes in bands not yet captured by soldiers or starvation, tried to forget the violations. Some of us, unable to escape the missions, hid amongst the men, passed as just men, tried to whisper our knowledge to a few survivors, pass on the negotiations with death which life requires. We weren't trying to save ourselves. We were trying to save the world. But we disappeared, murdered or heartbroken, and the end of the world came anyway. When all of the burying baskets and digging sticks were burnt, when only the shame remained with its stench of fear, we became Hotos. When our names were forgotten, our responsibilities forgotten, when we lost the gift of swimming in that liquid space between life and death, we became Hotos. Our families despised us. Old women gossiped about us. If our mothers fought to protect us, they were called Hoteras. If our names were recorded by history, it was only to reiterate our sins. If our bodies survived, our spirits were poisoned by ignorance and grief. How strange it is now to hear young voices calling to us, calling out names we have not heard since the baptismal font in the mission yard, names like Koitesi, Le'ichwakat, Yawataya, recorded alongside Amafrodita, Hoya, Amukeraru. Who remembers us? Who pulls us forgotten from beneath melted adobe and groomed golf courses and asphalted freeways, asks for our help, rekindles the work of our lives? Who takes up the task of weaving soul to body, carrying the dead from one world to the next? Who bears the two halves of spirit in the whole vessel of one body? Where have you been? Why have you waited so long? How did you ever find us buried under words like Hoto, like Hoya, under whips and lies? And what do you call us now? Never mind, little ones. Never mind. You are here now. Last. Come close. Listen. We have so much work to do. That is for my distant cousin, Victor Acedo, and I was very happy that for this new edition of the book, I found a photograph of Victor, and we can see his beautiful face. This next one is also an Isabel story. It's called Eulalia's Curse. Isabel Meadows said to the anthropologist, ethnologist J.P. Harrington, "Pero la maldición de la Eulalia cayó en la familia de los Sargents." But the curse of Eulalia fell on the Sargent family. Isabel says it was Eulalia's curse that killed Sargent. The American ran Estefana and her children off the land at Rancho El Potrero, the same land awarded to Estefana's parents, Fructuoso Chalom and Eugenia Maria Yunes, by the Mexican governor Alvarado after the mission was shut down. The very land where Echilat, the village of Fructuoso's mother, his maternal grandparents, and his great-grandmother, had existed long before the mission was a gleam in Father Sarah's eye. The American told Estefana, "Those signatures are no good anymore. Indians can't own land." Estefana and the other displaced Indians she had taken into her home carried their few belongings to the banks of the Carmelo River. They camped there a few days, paralyzed by grief and anger, wept themselves hollow with frustration. And then, Isabel says, they dispersed. 10 years later, Sargent fell into the Carmelo River while herding his cattle across during a storm. He became ill, and a few days later, he died. Isabel says what happened was Eulalia had cursed Sargent that day 10 years before, sitting there on the banks of the river, her worn skirts heavy and wet with rain and mud, her hair burnt short in mourning. She didn't have much left to work with. No bundles of mugwort, no roots, no cocoon rattle, not even a clapper stick. She was just an old Indian woman beaten by soldiers, chastised by priests. Her last grown child hung from the big oak as a horse thief by the Americans. She was cast off, discarded. She wanted to abandon her old woman's body, even if the Spaniards had killed all the two-spirit Huyas and left not one to carry her past the dangerous male and female gods that guarded the paths to the ancestors. But out of habit, Eulalia leaned down, her spine crackling with age, and scooped a handful of Carmel's clean water in her palm, brought it to her lips, drank it down. She tasted the cold roots of mountains off to the north. She felt the sharp grit of river sand in her worn molars, sparkle of a stray flake of gold, scales of a little fish on her tongue. And Eulalia remembered the river would be here long after she was gone. Will you miss us, river? She wondered. Will you miss our feet on your riverbed, our twined fishing nets combing your waters, our sacrifice of the first salmon every year? Isabel says the river must have said yes, because where else would Eulalia have gotten this idea? She reached down, plucked a smooth round stone from beneath the water, spoke to it in the old language. She gathered salt from the estuary to the west, a gritty sand mixed with ocean and fresh water spirits. She added charcoal from that last fire built on the river's banks by the refugees, great oaks reduced to ashes. She smudged the curse in the scent of toasted chia seeds made for the journey away, the scorched redbud of the basket that held them. Eulalia made that curse of mud, the decomposing body of our mother, black and thick enough to trip even a strong stock horse. She made that curse from slick water weeds that can tangle a man's legs, pull him down beneath the surface. She made that curse out of a rainstorm's rage, conjured waves 10 years hence into heavy walls that would fall like the stones of a church in an earthquake. The Americans say Eulalia cursed the river, but Isabel says no, Eulalia wouldn't do that. Isabel says Eulalia gave the river the idea to curse Sargent. But rivers tell time differently than people, and so it took 10 years before the river finished what Eulalia had begun. Eulalia was long since dust on the day the river took Sargent, took his life from him like that, drank him down, and cleansed itself of his greed. Isabel says, wherever they are, she's sure Eulalia's bones are laughing. Sometimes when I read something like what Isabel said, Eulalia left a curse on this family, and I think, I wonder how that happened. And so that's how that story came out. Okay, boy, my timing is working. I saved a long story for the last. I've never read this story out loud in public before. It's funny how a book can hold something for you until you're ready to read it. This is Coyote Takes a Trip. It starts with a quote from a soldier, Pedro Fages, from 1775. And Pedro says, I have substantial evidence that those Indian men who, both here in Santa Barbara and farther inland, are observed in the dress, clothing, and character of women, there being 2 or 3 such in each village. They pass as sodomites by profession, it being confirmed that all these Indians are much addicted to this abominable device and permit the heathen to practice the unnatural abuse of their bodies. They are called Hoyas and are held in great esteem by their community. Standing in the cold, sand-swept Venice Beach parking lot, watching his clothing scatter in the 4 directions, Coyote decided to head for New Mexico, catch up with his brother, and leave his broken heart behind. He'd been living on Venice Beach for a long time. He liked the ocean with its tall jade winter waves and generous people who camped in the parking lot. Something about their vehicles, old school buses, pickup trucks with handmade campers, station wagons from the 1970s equipped with curtains and propane stoves, felt like home. Coyote was always welcome to add a paw print or play with bright paints, contribute his own unique touch to the vivid vehicle decor. And no one objected to his new favorite signature, a bumper sticker of two naked women kissing. On Venice Beach, even in the winter, Coyote could get cheap pizza by the slice at a kiosk that also sold Pall Malls and condoms, find regular guys up, always ready for a good game of Go or checkers, or soak up an afternoon's entertainment from a wandering minstrel with a sexy 3-string guitar and a cheerfully resigned dog. Not to mention the sweet, crazy woman with sleeping bags in the back of her van, just waiting for Coyote to heat them up. But this one winter, the rain just didn't let up. The sand never dried off, the paint bled off his best graffiti, and the sleeping bags felt damp and gritty. Heavy squalls blew in off the Pacific day after day. The checker players hunched grouchily under the few covered shelters, arguing about whose turn it was to score some hot coffee. And even the cement walkway between Venice Beach and the Santa Monica Pier seemed sodden. Must be friggin' global warming, Coyote muttered to himself, wringing out the only pair of socks he owned. Yeah, Coyote figured maybe he'd take a road trip to see his brother in the drier climes of New Mexico, where it might be colder, but at least a guy could stand outside for a smoke without wearing a plastic garbage bag. Seemed like his sweet, crazy woman wasn't so sweet anymore. Maybe more crazy than sweet, eh? Why else would she move her van while he was out cruising, walking the beach? He'd come back from a little hot chocolate sipping under the pier to find his rickety suitcase teetering, lonely and frayed, in the empty parking lot. Coyote surveyed his wardrobe of obscene T-shirts and gangsta pants, scattered amongst the scraggly pigeons and seagulls, and grabbed a few handfuls. Time was he wouldn't be caught dead with baggage, but the economy wasn't what it used to be. He tucked the soggy mess into the rickety rolling suitcase that served as pack mule and safety deposit box, shook the sand out of his fur, hitched up his low-riding green canvas pants, and slouched up the hill to catch a number 1 Santa Monica Big Blue bus to Westwood. From there, he could catch a shuttle to LAX, where he had relatives who worked in baggage. Maybe one of them could box him up and put him on a nonstop to Albuquerque. Anything was better than this soggy gray sponge of a beach. Trudging past the bright but mostly empty tattoo shops, massage parlors, and taquerias in Venice, Coyote wondered how his life had taken such a tragic turn. He'd lost his mojo, that's what it was. Lost his touch, lost his way, lost his magic. It must be these SoCal women he'd been hanging with. Made him feel every one of his immemorial years old. Geez, they wanted you to bring home groceries. As if that's what Coyote does. Groceries? What woman in her right mind would waste her coyote on groceries? Yeah, he'd never had any trouble getting fed or otherwise taken care of until this winter. But something, maybe the endless rain, was diluting his powers. My prowess, thought Coyote, bumping his old green suitcase up and down over curbs and around puddles. Dude, where's my prowess? I can't even hold my tail up anymore, let alone my pecker. The shoulders of his jean jacket slumped, excess inches of pants sloshed in the rain. Coyote stood at the bus stop with water dripping off his snout and didn't even have the heart to flick his ears. Oh well. At least the bus was pulling up. He had 75 cents for the ride, and there was his brother's wife's cooking in the near future. Just thinking about a big round bowl of Macaria's smoldering beans topped with diced peppers and a big round hunk of goat cheese cheered Coyote up a little bit. Oh, Macaria's homemade corn tortillas. He perked up enough to let 3 old ladies get on the bus ahead of him. Of course, that meant the 3 old ladies took the last 3 seats on the bus, the row right up front under the sign that said, in English and Spanish, "Please give up these seats for elderly and disabled patrons." On the opposite wall of the bus, behind the driver, were more seats, but they'd been folded up earlier for a wheelchair and never restored. Coyote lurched awkwardly, trying to pull a seat down without losing his balance on the already moving bus, but he couldn't find the right button or switch. "Story of my life," he growled. Finally, he just threw his suitcase down on the floor and plopped right on it. He smiled up innocently at the 3 old ladies, one black, one India, one Korean, as he perched at their feet. "Bunch of dried up old viejas. What's so funny?" Crouching on his suitcase at eye level with 3 old women's knobby knees, his cold feet throbbing and wet pants clinging to his cold calves, Coyote made a discovery. It was something he'd never noticed before. All 3 of these broads had perfectly dry pant hems. Of course, that meant that when they sat down, their high waters rose practically to their knees, but he had to admit, it also meant they didn't suffer from water wicking up the fabric and freezing them to death either. Interesting, Coyote thought, but distinctly uncool. And in the gaps between the saggy tops of their white tube socks and the bottom of their polyester stretch waist pants, strips of even less attractive, bare, hairy skin gaped. Aye. Well, hairy on 4 of the 6 legs. At least the Indigenous woman, the one in the middle, seemed relatively smooth-skinned. Coyote sniffed. She used lotion, too. Or maybe just a nice laundry detergent. Fresh. Lilacs, maybe. Or could it be lavender? Gee, it'd been so long since he'd been with a woman who actually did her laundry with something besides public restroom pump soap. Coyote tilted his head so he could get a look at that middle woman's hands grasping the curved, dark top of her wooden cane. He didn't want to seem obvious. Ah, yes, a modest but tasteful home manicure. Nails not long enough to do a guy damage, but grown out a bit, filed, polished with clear stuff, and clean. No wedding band, he noticed, but a nice silver signet ring on the left pinky, turquoise stone, probably an old high school sweetheart's token. Cinnamon-colored skin, weather-worn, but not too wrinkly, hard-working hands, sturdy hands, with calluses and a few old scars across the back, a scattering of well-deserved age spots. Sidebar. When the missionaries first arrived in this region of San Diego, they found men dressed as women and performing women's duties who were kept for unnatural purposes. From their youth up, they were treated, instructed, and used as females, and were even frequently publicly married to the chiefs or great men. Being more robust than the women, they were better able to perform the arduous duties required of the wife, and for this reason they were often selected by the chiefs and others, and on the day of the weddings, a grand feast was held. Father Jeronimo Boscana, 1846. She would never have been a beauty, Coyote admitted, but with those hands, she surely could have made a man happy. She even had a cloth shopping bag sticking out of her coat pocket. Obviously off to the grocery store, Senior Tuesdays at Vaughn's, he remembered. Important day for those beach dwellers on a budget. He risked a quick glance up at her face as she shifted to let someone squeeze toward the exit. She knew how to use makeup, that was certain. A little foundation, some blue eyeshadow, but not too much, and a discreet but feminine coral pink lipstick. A bit heavy on the rouge, perhaps, but then again, maybe that extra tinge was from the effort of hoofing it up to the bus stop in the rain. Firm chin, a good nose with some arch to it. Not ashamed of her strength, he decided. Her hair, mostly silver with black streaks, pulled back into a tight braid and protected from the elements by one of those plastic baggy things old women always carry in their purses. Suave in a sweet way. She'd tied a silky blue scarf, just the right color to set off her eyeshadow, at her throat. Coyote would have liked a better look at her neck, but as it was, he was surprised to find that one old woman could hold his attention this long. Shit. What was he thinking? He was on his way out of here. This was not the best time to be ogling a woman. Disgruntled and hungry, he looked out the wide front windows at the rain and resisted the awful thought that he was inside a mobile aquarium. Okay, he thought, I'm on the road heading toward a whole plate of Macaria's enchiladas. Lost in his dreams of glory, culinary and otherwise, Coyote damn near missed his stop. "Wait," he yelped, leaping up to snag the yellow pull cord and bending down just as rapidly to grab the worn handle of his rickety suitcase. "Wait for me." Scrabbling, Coyote had an odd, hobbled sensation, like a horse, unable to move more than a few increments in any direction, no matter how hard he tried. And what was that cold breeze at his back, or rather, his backside? Just as he straightened fully, suitcase firmly in his left hand, Coyote's very baggy pants, held up by a dirty white piece of rope, suddenly became a lot baggier. Oops. Not only was his butt hanging out for all the world to see, but so was his pride and joy, and wouldn't you know it, right at eye level with the old Indita who'd been ignoring him for the whole ride. There was something about her expression that he couldn't quite figure out, but it reminded him of his brother's face when they'd hit the jackpot in Vegas one time. An involuntary guffaw escaped Coyote's mouth as he grabbed the front of his pants and yanked up, clung desperately to the handle of his suitcase, and tried to spontaneously sprout another hand as the bus driver went from 30 miles an hour to nothing, screeching to a halt. Barreling forward, Coyote blew right past the driver, bounced off the dashboard and down the steps, landing breathless and barely clothed at the foot of a gently dripping palm tree. He looked up at the bus windows to see 3 pairs of eyes staring back. The black woman's face was mapped with new laugh lines Coyote knew he had just personally inscribed. The Korean grandma's eyes glittered with outrage, her lips moving with words he was glad he could only imagine. But the old Indian lady, could it be? Was he just imagining it, or, well, was she giving him the eye? Admiring his prowess? Almost applauding what she'd witnessed for one brief, sweet minute? Coyote felt it then, his mojo, like an illegal firecracker smuggled off the res, like a long drink out of a fresh bottle of tequila. It was coming back to him, streaming into him, filling him with a terrible joy. That was no little old lady. The qualities that had so intrigued Coyote, that mix of strength and serene femininity, that old lady was a glammed up and impressed old man. The bus squealed out of there, the driver blasting into traffic, and Coyote found himself with a suitcase in one hand, his family jewels in the other, and a confused but very happy mojo. He stared after the bus, unconsciously licking his chops. Not exactly a man. What was that old word? Hoto? No, older than that and sweeter. Hoya, jewel of the people? Nope, still Spanish, and just thinking it conjured up vile images of humiliation before loved ones. No, we had our own words before the padres and soldados de cuero, Coyote thought. It was coming back to him now. How many beautiful words, each tribe creating a title as unique as the being it described. Sidebar. The priests at Mission Santa Clara were advised that 2 pagans had gone into one of the houses of the neophytes, one in his natural clothing, the other dressed as a woman. Such a person was called a Hoya. Immediately, the missionary, with the corporal and a soldier, went to the house to see what they were looking for, and there they found the 2 in an unspeakably sinful act. They punished them, though not as much as they deserved. The priest tried to present to them the enormity of their deed. The pagan replied that the Hoya was his wife. Father Francisco Palu, 1777. Standing on the sidewalk, Coyote rolled his slippery pink tongue around in his mouth as if he could rattle the lost names out from between his teeth. One word in particular, something he'd learned long ago on a warm beach, whispered by a Ventureño with sparkling eyes and a ticklish belly. A word that meant honor, medicine, truth. Then his mouth remembered, and Coyote cried the Chumash word aloud, Aquí. He looked down the street toward the airport shuttle stop, then back down Westwood toward Santa Monica Boulevard and Venice Beach. He must live down there. He was sure he'd seen her around. Yeah, he sat off to the side during the checkers matches and read books, sometimes brought a bag of cookies from the hostess discount bakery to share. always had a warm chuckle when Coyote threw up his arms in a triumph, or a soft ah and a of tongue in sympathy when Coyote slumped in defeat. What name did the Aki go by? Dolores, Estefana, Juanita. It was really cold in Albuquerque this time of year, Coyote remembered. Icy even. Slowly, Coyote pulled up his baggies and reknotted the ratty rope around his waist. He replayed that swift glance of pleasure from Juanita, his thrilling moment of chaotic revelation, his tail waving and erect. Then, without waiting for the light to change, he pulled out the extended handle of his rickety rolling suitcase and hauled it across the street where the big blue bus number 1 headed back down to Venice for a mere 75 cents. A cheap trip, Coyote thought, smiling amid a chorus of honks from a Prius, a Mercedes, and a shiny yellow Hummer, accented by well-honed expletives from their drivers. He didn't mind. Now he knew where his mojo had gone, and he was going to be there waiting when it came back this afternoon. Hell, he might even help carry the groceries. Thank you so much.
Deborah, thank you for sharing those passages from Bad Indians. At least one of them is from the new expanded edition. The others have been there from the start. One of the things that I love about this book is how inventive you are with the different kinds of literary expression. I think of you from your publishing history as primarily a poet, and you can tell me if that's a fair assessment or not. But so what made you want to supplement or include other kinds of literary voices? In Bad Indians, you write prose memoir, you annotate your daughter's coloring book, you create your own version of a mission glossary. There's a lot of very subversive, dialogical kinds of literature. So back to that question of you as a poet and then moving into these other kinds of literature.
Well, I have to say it surprised me. I went into writing this book thinking I would take my grandfather's recordings, which I had them transferred from old cassette tapes to CDs, so I could, stop and start them without harming them. I thought I would translate and transcribe those and write a very scholarly book about what it was like to be the survivor of the missions, what it was like to be born in 1903 at the very bottom of the California Indian population when we had gone from 1 million to 10 or 15,000 in about 150 years. And I started doing my research because I thought, well, I'll do a lot of contextual stuff, to show why he was here and how he got here. And I was primarily a poet, and I think that actually was perfect preparation for what I ran into in the archives. I ran into a lot of very painful stories that dealt with my direct relatives. So these were not even, ancestors that I didn't know I was connected to. I was talking about my grandparents, my great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. And through the research, I came to know them very intimately, very personally. So when I read about so-and-so being a really bad Indian, he was stealing cattle all the time, and he received the subsequent floggings with these horrible cat o' nine tails, which would then get infected and affect everything about his life. I wanted to know more about that, and so I would research, further into mission records and the Padres' letters and find out, well, if you look at his family in the baptismal record, you find this guy had 10 children. And if you look in the burial book, you'll find that all these children were subsequently dying of malnutrition and starvation. So of course he was stealing cattle. Of course he was raiding gardens. He was trying to feed his family. So those kinds of things almost dictated themselves to me as poetry. That was what I knew how to do with really giant pieces of pain that I wanted to make some sense of, right? I wanted to not have this be a story of victimization, but a story for us, a story for those of us who came afterwards. And that required a different kind of language than the academic language I thought I had been going to use. So each time I ran into a piece of information, I let it be whatever form, whatever genre it felt like it needed to be. I really feel like that wasn't all my choice. I really feel that there was some guidance from ancestral energies there, because I did run into things that needed to be drawn or needed to be put into a form, like, do your mission project kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think the material itself was so fragmented. The stories were so fragmented. I could never know everything about one person. So doing things in little pieces also made sense, because I could make it just a little bit more complete, like a window. Oh, this is what you're seeing through the window right now. Okay, next window, next doorway. Because when you're dealing with fragments, you're not ever going to have the whole story. But that doesn't mean there isn't a story there. That doesn't mean that the fragments can't come together and create a bigger story, a larger story. So I think those choices, they happened because I was open to them. They happened because I had time. I was on sabbatical, which is like worth its weight in gold. Mm-hmm. And because I was alone and isolated, I was based at UCLA, but I stayed in a little studio by myself. My partner was 3,000 miles away, and I had a lot of time to feel and to think and to listen to those stories. So they just kind of came out the way they came out.
Mm-hmm. So one of the stories that you tell, or let's say in many of the stories, we can hear Spanish being spoken. Now, as you were reading, there were some Spanish words, and part of the story that you're telling in Bad Indians is the story of missionization, a very cutting and critical, ironic, and tragic story, or a cutting tone that tells us a tragic story. And I was thinking, the students from Spanish 135 AC are in this room with us. I'm a Spanish professor. Many of the students here are majors or minors in Spanish. So tell us, what's the story of Spanish in California that you would like us to know about, or that you would like Spanish speakers and Spanish learners to know about?
I want to quote Joy Harjo and Gloria Bird and say it was the enemy's language. It was the language of colonization, but so were French and Portuguese. European languages in general were the languages of conquest, and they were violently imposed on the indigenous peoples who lived on this continent. So for me, Spanish is not a friendly language. And I can remember my dad telling me that he had to go learn Spanish on the streets when he was growing up. He grew up in Santa Monica mostly. And he had to go learn it on the streets to survive because everybody else spoke Spanish, but also because his parents refused to speak it. So here they have these very Hispanic names. My grandmother's name was Marquesa, and my grandfather went by Tom, but it was Tomas. But they had come from a family that very much rejected that language. I think they probably understood it, and I think that their parents probably spoke it, but they still spoke indigenous languages, which just breaks my heart. Sorry. It breaks my heart because they didn't pass that on to their children. But they had grown up knowing that the language that was safe to speak was Spanish and English, and they chose English. My dad was always embarrassed by his Spanish. I remember we came to California once together, and we're staying at a hotel. And for the first time ever, I heard him speak Spanish in public to the woman who came to clean our room. And he was telling her that he'd left her a tip. But other than that, he was very embarrassed by his Spanish. So I didn't grow up in a real Spanish-friendly household. And I think I really feel that in my bones when I'm trying to write about it.
It comes through. It comes through. It's very
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No, it's actually a very defamiliarizing and interesting perspective. So I see that for students who have to get to another class, maybe it's time for me to open this up to questions before more students have to leave. So let's turn to the audience and see if there are questions for Deborah.
Please ask.
Come on, Spanish 135. I know you've got some questions.
I came all the way from Eugene, guys.
All right.
I just wanted to ask about your research process. You mentioned that a lot of it was fragmented, and obviously a lot of information is missing or told through the lens of the Spanish Padres. So I just wanted to ask how you started that and how you went about looking for those sorts of sources.
I had a mother who had trained herself as a genealogist. She actually worked at a TV station, but her side gig was genealogy. And so I think I grew up with a model of patience and real persistence. I will look for something till the end of my days. You know, I'm still looking for that picture of Estefana that Harrington talks about, and I know it exists. But in the meantime, you find all these other things. So a lot of the time it's by accident. You just throw yourself into the archives looking for one thing, and you find 10 other things. So you have to be a little organized and say, okay, this material is great, I'm gonna put it over here. I'm still looking for Estefana, but I'm gonna find her someday. I think the key thing is to stay open, that it might be anywhere. It might be under any search term, a search term that you haven't thought of yet, a misspelled name. I've done a lot of research with the mission records from the California missions, which have since my mom's day been digitalized and put online. She would have paid money for that. But also you have to learn how to be willing to read a strange language. So I can read Spanish pretty well. I can read Old Spanish really well. And I can read Old Castilian Spanish handwriting pretty well. But I had to learn how to do that, and it was a struggle. But I found other people were in the same struggle, and so we shared old words and old dictionaries. Networking is really, really important. I started a blog when the year I was at UCLA working on this book, and I started a blog purposely so I could put some of my struggles and some of the things I'd found out there so that other people would see it and contact me. So you think you're doing it in isolation, but really you're collaborating with a million other people who have been down a similar road. So I don't have any big research secrets except persistence and be innovative. You know, what if he spelled his name this way? What if, you know, this record, what if this record is a year off? Try looking in the year before. Yeah, just a lot of it is, I don't want to say luck, but a lot of it is you create kind of your own luck by being willing to be there all the time. Researchers need to be obsessive. Luckily I am. It worked out. But yeah, the more you research, the more you find, the more surprises and gifts that will show up. Yeah, so it's really just getting in there and doing it on a regular basis.
Are there other questions? Anjali?
Hi. I don't know if this is maybe a personal question, but have you done, clearly your writing is a form of ancestral work that you've done, is there other forms, or maybe do you do special writings that you to defamiliarize yourself and continue the ancestral work that you've been doing?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Ancestral work as in like the idea or the practice of going back to your genealogy and looking at the genocide and all of the injustices that have been done to your family, and kind of in your own way heal through the genealogy. And I see that in your memoir in Bad Indians, when you write the letters of all the things that you went through. And I guess my question is, going off of that, you started with letters and then you went into writing. You continue doing it through writing. Is there other practices that you do whenever you know that writing goes to research to continue healing not only yourself, but your genealogy and, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I ever stopped writing Bad Indians. It's out there, it's published. I was so happy when Heyday wanted to do a 10-year anniversary, and they asked me if I happened to have any more pieces for it, and I was, yes, I can't stop writing it, I can't stop researching. So the material continues to give, and I feel like it's my job to receive it and shape it and put it back out there so that it's more accessible and more people can know about it. I feel it's become very reciprocal. It's not just me trying to, it's not just me trying to heal the ancestors, right? It's the ancestors having information that we need to know to heal us. And I think that keeping that motion, that kind of circular motion going, is one of the most amazing, astonishing things that came out of writing this. And it has seeped into all my other work. It seeps into my poetry, which technically I might start writing a poem that's not about the missions or my ancestors at all, but it sneaks in. And I have a little bit of my artwork in Bad Indians, but I have been doing more and more sort of found art assemblage kinds of pieces since then, and a lot of bookmaking. And they're books that are constructed. They're not necessarily just books that are bound in the traditional way. So they do strange things. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that this material is evolving. And one of the things I always think and always say is that this is a collaborative act, not just between myself and the ancestors, but between myself and everybody who reads the book and everybody who teaches the book. It continues to just go on out into the world and do the job of healing and decolonizing, which aren't always the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, in the back.
Hello, thank you so much. I guess my question has to do with, has your work interacted with current missions in terms of, I know, I believe there was mention that there was going to be a book, like a coffee table book, that then can be sold at missions. Me, that I visited a mission and witnessed kind of like the genocidal propaganda, I guess I'm wondering if there has been current interaction between your work and missions and kind of as a place, as a location. Yeah.
I actually was blown away to have somebody tell me that Bad Indians was actually being sold in a mission gift shop. Only one, I think, and I think it might have something to do with Vince Medina. But I have not had repercussions from mission authorities in any way, although they do get their digs in when they can. But I think that it would be fabulous to have the option of buying a book from an Indigenous person in the mission workshops, and that's why I'm working on that that mission coffee table book, excuse me, I don't think it will ever be sold in missions, but I would have said that about Bad Indians too. So that's not my audience necessarily, or at least that's not my platform. I think that people come to Bad Indians other ways. And I just got an email the other day from a man who said, I went with my son to the mission on his school field trip, and I spoke up all these times, and I got banned. And I almost got the school banned from the mission because he was interrupting the docent and the little spiel that she was giving. So the missions are not friendly places, obviously, for California Indians then or now, for the most part. And there are some missions that are doing things like including indigenous ceremony in their Catholic services, for example. But in general, it's a tough audience. But I haven't had a lot of policing either from, people who don't like the book just don't read it. I do have a cousin who said, I'm never going to read it. And I had a sister who probably wouldn't have read it either, but she told me that speaking Esalen was speaking the devil's language. So there are very strong opinions out there. And I don't feel the least bit sorry about disrupting people. I think that disrupting the dominant culture's narrative, which has had lots of time and space in the archive and in our daily lives, I don't think disrupting that is a bad thing. It can be difficult personally, but it's worth it. And my dad would have hated this book, by the way. He didn't want me to write about him or anybody else in the family, ever. Fortunately, he's gone before the book came out, so he didn't have to deal with it.
Yeah.
Thank you for this.
I think the mic is coming. One second.
Thank you. I saw how important Indian language is in your poetry, but then just learned that language transmission stopped with your grandparents. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us the story about how Indian languages came back into your life?
Right here, you see Berkeley. At the end of that year, when I was writing Bad Indians, my sister Louise, who's chair of the Esalen Nation, was planning to come to Breath of Life in June. And she said, Debbie, which is what my sisters call me, Debbie, you need to come. You're here. It'll be really good for you. I came last year and it was amazing. So I did. And it was pretty incredible. I'm sure people know how it works, but it was beautifully, beautifully set up. And I'm still in touch with the linguistics student who helped me write my first Esalen poem, Ruth Rouvière. So that, my sister had already instigated that. She'd started the year before. And for her, it was, Esalen just comes so easily. And she told me that she remembers sitting under the kitchen table, hearing the grandparents speaking in these indigenous languages. I never had that. I wonder how much, that shaped her brain, right? Her brain's ability to be flexible with languages. And so that was for me, that was the start of it. It could have started a little earlier when my grandpa Tom, who's in the book, when he passed away, when he was dying, his older son, my uncle Tommy, went to sit with him. And he came away saying, Dad's speaking Indian. He was speaking Chumash of all things. His language would have been Esalen. Chumash was his wife's language. But I thought, well, they probably spoke each other's languages by that point. So Uncle Tommy went to Santa Ynez, to the reservation, and found some people who could speak Chumash and started speaking. And he remembered it. It came back to him. He didn't know he knew it. My dad knew one word of Chumash. He told me that word. It was the word for water, and it was all. And he could make that sound, but I can't make that sound. But that was all that was passed on to me. Yeah, so I'm really grateful that there are ways in. And one of the best things about Breath of Life is they help you learn how to research. Speaking of research techniques, they don't teach it to you in a week. They teach you how to find your language, which is a skill that a lot of us needed. Yeah.
Deborah, we've run out of time. I know I have so many more questions, and maybe other people do as well, but let's say thank you, and then people can come up and say hi to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.